Hi guys, it's Danny. Today we're gonna discuss about watering orchids and if you are over watering your orchid or not. I received a comment from one of my viewers who has a little bit of a problem watering his Camellia orchid. And I totally understand that sometimes you might be a little bit confused about how often to water because many articles suggest that you don't overwater or water once a week and so on. But this is quite variable. So I will not go into specifics. I have tutorials on how to water some of the most common orchids like Phalaenopsis orchids, Camellia orchids, Oncidium orchids, Vandas. I'll link them down below if you're interested in a more in-depth tutorial on how to water them and how often, but as a general idea, I will just make a summary on how you can figure out if you should water your orchid or not, no matter what orchid you have. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about why everybody says you should not over water your orchid. It practically means that you shouldn't water too often, and you might find articles that suggest you should water once a week or stuff like that. Well, it's really variable. It doesn't always apply. It really depends on your environment. So what you need to know is that the vast majority of orchids you have don't like to stay soggy wet all the time. So practically the medium they come in should not be wet all the time, constantly. So you really should not water as often as to keep everything wet all the time. But pretty much this is all it means. Now, how often you should water? Well, this is really different for each and every one of us because I might grow them in a different pot than you do or in a different media and so on. So my drying time will differ from your drying time. If I water my orchid once a week, it doesn't mean you should water your orchid once a week as well. So if you are concerned you are watering your orchid too often, if you water every 2 days or 3 days, well, there is a simple answer to that. First of all, know your orchid and what it prefers. If you have a Camellia orchid, you might know that it doesn't like to stay wet for too long, and also it likes to dry out in between waterings. Now, this does not mean you need to water once a week. No, this only means that you need to water when all the media and the roots are dry. And I have an example here. You can see my Camellia orchid is pretty dry. The roots are not green, and also if I look through the pot, I can see this media is dry. I am very safe now to water my Camellia orchid. When did I water it last? About 3 days ago. So practically I'm watering this Camellia every 3 days. Now this is not too much for me because my media dries within 3 days. For you, this media might dry every day or every 7 days. It really depends on your climate. If it's warm and dry, obviously the water will evaporate faster. If it's humid and cold, the water will evaporate slower. Also, if you have a big orchid with a big root system, that orchid will absorb more water. So again, it might dry up faster for you. Also, I am growing my orchid in bark, which retains a little bit of water. But you might grow your orchid in charcoal, which does not retain water almost at all. So you might actually have to water once every day because your media dries accordingly. So theoretically, if you water whenever your Camellia orchid is completely dry, you will never overwater it, no matter if you water it every day or every 5 days. It's not a rule that you should only water once a week or once every X amount of days. This can vary. It can also vary seasonally. Maybe in wintertime you will need to water less frequent. And in summertime you should actually water every 2 days because this is how fast your media dries. Now this is valid for any orchid you might have. All you need to know is the preference of your orchid. For example, Phalaenopsis orchids should be watered when the roots are dry as well, no matter when this happens. Every week, every other day, every 5 days, really depends. All you need to do is observe your orchid and figure out a sort of a schedule. You will start to see a sort of a pattern, maybe seasonal pattern, maybe your environment pattern, and so on. If you have an Oncidium, which doesn't really like to dry out, you obviously will water when the media is almost dry. So if it's still a bit moist, you are safe to water it. But again, this can happen every week, every 5 days, every 2 days. It depends on a lot of things. But the bottom line is, you just need to observe it. And if you have a clear pot like I do, it's really easy to see when the media and the roots are dry. However, you might have a pot which is not transparent. So how do we know when to water an orchid potted in such a thing? Well, it's easy really in this case as well. One thing you can do is actually feel with your finger if the media is properly dried. But sometimes you might not be able to really make a decision because your finger can only go to a certain length. But you can absolutely use a bamboo stick, bamboo skewer, you can find it at the supermarket, and just stick it inside the pot all the way to the bottom. Leave it standing like this for 10 or 15 minutes and afterwards pull it out. And try to see if the bamboo stick got wet. If it's wet, it means your media is still a bit moist, or more moist, depends. But if it's dry, your media is dry as well. You can also figure out if your media stays more moist at the bottom and drier at the top. Practically make a sort of an assessment of how your media dries, and then take the decision if you need to water or not. You can also look at your orchid, depending what orchid you have. You might notice the pseudobulbs starting to shrivel, and after you water them, they will plump back up. This means that when they started to shrivel, the pot got a little bit too dry for this orchid's preference. Now, I would just like to make a little side note here. Everything that I just told you applies to healthy orchids with a good root system. If your orchid does not have enough roots or no roots at all, you will notice signs of dehydration on your orchid no matter how much you water. And this is because there are no roots actually to absorb the water. So first of all, make sure that your orchid is healthy and that it has a healthy root system. Because if it does not have a root system, you will always see shriveled pseudobulbs or limpy leaves. And that's a whole different story. But if your orchid looks healthy, it has a good root system, and you simply cannot figure out how often is too often, just go with what you see in the media and what the orchid tells you and how the roots look like. If somehow your media dries out completely within 2 days, it's not too often to water every 2 days. However, if your media is still wet after 5 days, then you shouldn't water every 5 days, you should wait a little more. Well, depending on the orchid, of course. So as you can see, there isn't a rule of water after X amount of days. This will always vary, even within your environment. It might be seasonal. Maybe it will not vary too much in a normal home where conditions are a bit more stable. But again, you need to figure out how things dry out in your particular environment. So this is why I never say water it once a week or once every 5 days and so on. It really just depends. And as long as you observe the orchid and the pot and water when it actually prefers to be watered, it doesn't really matter how often a week you actually water your orchid. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me remind you that in the description you have links for specific species. So if you don't know the preference of a Callia orchid or a Phalaenopsis orchid regarding watering, just visit the links below. I have a few tutorials and hopefully they will help you out even more. So thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more videos from me, simply subscribe to my channel. I post on a regular basis. Also feel free to leave me comments with suggestions or questions about orchids in the comment section below and I'll get back to you. If you click on the left side of your screen, you'll be directed to orchidnature.com where you'll find care sheets, identification sheets, and also you can talk to us in the forum section. And on the right side of your screen, you can click to watch another orchid video. Thank you for joining. I'll see you next time. Bye!